Hey folks, it's Dave. Quite a while ago, probably about 8 months ago, I did a webinar with the Smith Micro folks on using Manga Studio. And during the webinar, a lot of questions came up. Looks like we got something like 60 questions or so. And I really only got to about 5 of the questions in the video. So I'm making kind of a long video today to go through as many of those questions as possible. Some of them were duplicates. And so I'm going to try and simplify and combine the questions where possible, and also where there were similar questions. So what I'll do is I'll read the questions out here, and then I'll just answer them. So if you were part of the webinar, then here's an opportunity to get answers finally to your questions. I apologize for the delay. All right, let's get started. Okay, so these questions are broken up into categories. The first category has to do with 3D models. So let's get going with those. All right, question was, what program do you use to map your 3D files? Primarily these days I use Autodesk Maya. I used to use 3ds Max, but since I've been primarily working on an Apple computer, 3ds Max is not available as a Windows-only machine, but I use Maya. Have you ever used the 3D models in Manga Studio to construct your figure's clothing? Well, no, I really haven't used them. I do love the idea of the 3D models, and I've suggested several times in the past that it would be interesting in the future to have a system where we can add our own 3D models and have some sort of a basic rigging set up with them. But you know what is a solution is you can always use another software like Poser. I have actually used Poser, which is also a software that Smith Micro released, to basically use as a foundation for drawings. That's something that I've done in the past. I didn't do it for Dreamside, but I know that that's a way that you can set up some reference. All right, question, do you ever use SketchUp to build environments? I've tried SketchUp. I did use it briefly, but honestly, I don't feel that I need SketchUp anymore, really, because Manga Studio has these perspective rulers, which are really fantastic, and I just don't really feel the need anymore to use a different software, because I can get the 3D environments pretty easily using the perspective rulers. And feel free to click the link below. I'm going to put a link here to another video by by Doug Hills, who goes over the 3D. I'm sorry, the perspective rulers, so you can learn how to use them. Okay, question was, do you ever use the Mannequin to work on poses? I'm guessing by Mannequin, this is similar to the previous question about using the 3D models in Manga Studio, and what I'm going to do is, since I've already answered that question, I'll answer what this could also be asking, which is, do I use an actual mannequin, like a wooden mannequin or something, to work on poses? And no, I don't. Where I learned to draw the figure is through figure drawing. And I've said many times in the past that I recommend figure drawing as a great way to learn how to draw the figure. It's sounds obvious, but it really is great. Going to figure drawing classes is a fantastic way to expose yourself to the figure in a very challenging way, because you're trying to draw directly from life, and a model will move a little bit. The poses will change throughout the course of the session, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge to capture what you see in real life and put it down on paper, and it does help you. I think a little bit more than drawing from still images on the computer, or photos of figures, because you are seeing it in 3 dimensions. It helps you see the depth of things. It hasn't already been translated into a 2D media. So I do recommend that you go to figure drawing as much as possible. Not only if you want to learn how to draw the figure, but if you want to learn how to draw in general, because I don't believe there's anything that you can draw that's more challenging than the human body, and to capture the spirit of a human being. Put that down on paper. If you can do that, I really think you can draw just about anything. Okay, question was, where do you find the 3D objects to import, and do you edit them yourself prior to importing? I model everything that I use in Dreamside myself, as I mentioned earlier, in Maya. So there are some objects that I will model. Basically, my logic for deciding whether or not I want to do a 3D model is the complexity of the object. If it's something that's very complex, if it has a lot of ornate detail or something, I may consider modeling it in 3D if it's going to be used substantially throughout the story. So a good example would be Sarah's hospital bed. The hospital bed has a lot of sort of technical details behind it, and it's a very precise shape. And I didn't want to have to constantly redraw it. I do typically, in fact, I do always edit the 3D objects. I usually will redraw the line. Whether I'm using Maya's tools for getting a sort of a toon outline or Manga Studios, I will still typically redraw and to some degree repaint. But the 3D object does provide a good foundation. So yeah, I don't find them. I model them. Okay, moving on to the next section. This is coloring. All right, question was, hello, are there any libraries of color swatches in Manga Studio? That I unfortunately don't know. I don't really use color swatches. In fact, I've somewhat jokingly in the past mentioned that I really don't do a very good job of keeping my colors consistent. But part of that is because I'm not working in a medium that I think is really all that important to get it just right. If I were illustrating a book traditionally, and I had my paints and I would mix my certain colors to get, maybe a character's skin tone for one page, I would do my best to match it for the next page. But frankly, I'd probably get a decent amount of it wrong. So I just don't really worry too much about that. So unfortunately, I can't really answer your question. Next question was, I especially wonder how he makes his colors so vibrant. Well, yeah, it's thank you for that. I do work pretty hard to make the colors vibrant, but a lot of that has to do with contrast. It's funny how an intense magenta, really bold magenta, really bright bold magenta will seem so much more vibrant over a black background than over a white background. And so vibrancy usually just has to do with contrast. Obviously, you can pick a color that's very saturated, but if you oversaturate everything, it does tend to, ironically, I guess it looks a little bit less vibrant overall, because you're just inundated and you have no focal point. So it does, to some degree, Dreamside's kind of a fine line, because the story is, I intend for it to be extremely colorful. And so I'm trying to do some things where I'm pushing the vibrancy. So I don't really want to have the kind of thing where, well, I'll keep an image mostly grayscale and then have that one color that pops out, which is a really great way to make a particular color stand out, but that's not really what I'm going for with Dreamside. So it's a challenge for me. But I think because I pick maybe a few colors that are very vibrant, but I keep some degree of contrast in there. So that I think that's really the key in general, is contrast. Next question was, I'm curious about your method of coloring. You have a very painterly style. Do you work with watercolor brushes or transparent marker brushes in Manga Studio 5? So the main coloring brush I use is the oil flat. I think that one works really well because it blends the colors in a natural way. You have to be a little careful with it because it does, on very high resolution documents, it does reveal its brush shape to some degree, and the repeating stamping of the brush. And to some degree, what I'm really doing there is an extra step that I think is what's really giving it the painterly style. In fact, there are several extra steps, but basically I don't just paint with the oil flat. What I do is I'll paint with the oil flat, and then I'll use the blending brushes, blending, blurring, to get in and further adjust the colors a little bit. And so I'll say, for example, if you paint with watercolor, All right, there's going to be certain areas where you have hard edges, and there are certain areas where you have soft edges, where it kind of fades out. And so what I'll do is usually after the fact, I'll go in and soften certain areas of the color block and leave other areas hard. And by doing that, it creates that, I think, a much more realistic and believable painted section. Okay, and then I also I made, and you know what I'll do is I'll make a separate video for this at some point, but I also painted some watercolor overlays. Basically, these are actual watercolor paintings that I did that are painted a certain way where they have a low contrast, but they contain art strokes. You know, they contain, I'm sorry, brush strokes. And so I can overlay that over the art in different ways to try and get that paper texture in there. So there are lots of tricks. It's funny, I've joked many times in the past that traditional artists, you know, in the past, especially in marketing, used to try so hard to make their work look almost digital. And then, you know, now here we are in the digital world, and we're trying so hard to make our work look organic that originated on the computer. I find that really funny. Okay, next question. Does David make swatches, or does he just find desirable colors in the color wheel, choose, and paint? Well, this, I guess I already answered. Yes, I just really pick desirable colors. You know, I do take advantage of the tab that lets you load a... I'm sorry, I don't know what it's called off the top of my head. Maybe I'll put a comment below. But you can load an image that you can then pick colors from. So I can load a previous image from a previous page and pick the colors from that, and that way I can be consistent if I want to, you know, make sure that I'm picking the same shirt color page by page. But again, I don't worry too much about keeping it consistent, and I don't think it matters. This is an animation, so I don't have to worry about, you know, that one frame that suddenly goes purple and it looks like a weird flash. Next question was, how can you convey such feelings without using colors, as for someone that uses mainly black and white? Well, that really, I mean, you're asking a difficult question there, because that's sort of all the tricks of painting. I guess visual storytelling is what you're asking about. And, you know, there's a book that I would recommend for you. It's called Framed Ink. I've glanced through it. I haven't really read it cover to cover, so I don't want to totally advocate for this book. But I do think that it goes over a lot of what makes visual storytelling work, and it's all, you know, focusing in black and white. You definitely don't need color. It adds another layer of complexity to the type of story that you're telling. And in fact, I have one piece that I worked on that is a piece that could really, it's from chapter 3, which is a nightmare chapter, and Sarah encounters the gray dragon, and it's this scene where the dragon has sort of kind of hit Sarah with these odd sort of tentacle shapes, and they've attached themselves to her head. And it's the whole thing is designed to be sort of symbolic of the process of getting like an IV and having other sorts of medicine that's being forced into the body, and it's done in a very surreal method, right? And I think that I wanted to, since Dreamside is ultimately a book for a younger audience, I wanted to convey the violent feeling of that experience, but I didn't want it to actually look violent. Okay, and so what I did was, I painted it very carefully so that the physical action that's happening is again, it's surreal. It's more symbolic than anything. And then what I did was I noticed that depending on the color that I picked, because the obvious color, the first one that came to mind was red. You know, to paint this in red and have it be really scary and all that. But when I toned it red, it was really frightening. It was really scary. But I found that if I changed the colors to like a cool blue, it sort of diluted the intensity of the scene. It's still freaky, and I think maybe part of the freakiness is that it's unexpected, and that sort of oddity, it can be frightening in a different way. But I do think I found the perfect balance for what I'm going for by playing with the colors. Okay, but the other side of it is if I did dilute the colors out and I just had it be black and white, it would have a different effect as well. So really, I'm sorry, but that question, I wish I could answer that question in a video like this. And maybe I can go through and do another video at some point to kind of talk about the making feeling apparent with in images, with or without color. But that's a very, very complex question. So stay tuned, and maybe I'll make another video in the future about that. Question was, what are your favorite tools for adding color? Well, that I alluded to earlier. That's I use primarily the oil flat brush, and I do occasionally dip into other tools. I really don't get too specific with them. I'll use just about anything if it gets the effect that I'm going for. So I just sort of play around and take it on a case-by-case basis, but the foundation is usually the oil flat brush. Question, do you spend more time on drawing or on coloring? Okay, you know what, honestly, I used to say coloring, but I think it's just about 50-50 now, and the reason it's 50-50 is actually, and this has changed since the webinar, because when I did the video series over the course of the past year, well, I guess almost a year and a half now, I have since edited the Dreamside art within the past 3 months or so, and I've redrawn a lot of it. And the reason is because when I went to print, I noticed that some of the outlines were a little bit thin. I noticed that it looked good on the screen in a lot of ways, but really on paper, it just wasn't cutting it. And so I modified the style. So because Dreamside's art tends to get a little bit detailed at times, I chose to go for more of a watercolor look, and I amplified the outlines a little bit. But in doing so, of course, I added many more outlines. And when you do that, it takes a lot longer. So I'd say probably it's about 50-50 at this point. All right, question was, I am curious when and how you plan for color in the image. Is the moody quality of the finished image a result of work done completely after fleshing out the structural drawing, as you are here, I'm sure referencing the video on the webinar, or had you already planned for the color scheme before beginning the drawing? I would say that I have probably an especially disorganized process for coloring. Of course, I have foundational colors. I know that Sarah, for example, has very pale skin. I know that the Dream Girl has darker skin. Okay, so it's easy for me to go through and put those foundations in. I know what the characters. One thing about Dreamside is that Sarah's costume changes throughout the story. I do, but I do use color to some point to make the character iconic. And for Sarah, it's mainly blues. You'll notice that she always has some degree of blue on her. And so by committing to that blue, I know that as I approach her colors, to some degree, I'm going to be using blue. Okay. And so, depending on the nature of the scene, I may come at the scene with some sort of a preconceived idea of how I want to color it. But most of the time, I'm deciding as I go. I've done some concept art, but even with the concept art in general, I do tend to tweak it quite a bit as I go, and I'll play with colors and move them around. So I have a very disorganized method of coloring. But what's cool about that is, provided you can take the time to do that, because it does take longer, you're sort of, pushing through the fog, just trying to find your way toward the end. And I also want to make mention, on that note of saying fog, I want to make mention to another thing. I actually don't have a very good visual brain, which I know, at least to my friends and family, has been somewhat surprising for me to say, but I really have a very difficult time visualizing what I'm going for with an image. I know very strongly what I want it to feel like, and I know exactly what I want this story to be. But I have a very, very hard time visualizing the finished artwork in my head. Okay, so for me, it takes me a little bit longer because I'm sort of finding the image as I go. And I think that's cool because, first of all, it's fun. It makes it, every drawing is a discovery. But it can be very frustrating because I know what I want the finished piece to feel like, but I don't quite know how to get there. So there's a lot of it that is figured out as I go. Okay. All right, next question. If there's time, I would love to hear his feedback on his coloring process. Well, I think I've pretty much covered that with these past few questions, so let's move on from there. Okay, next section is equipment. All right, question was, what computer did he say he uses? A companion? Is that like the Cintiq? Yes, it is like the Cintiq. I actually use two Cintiqs. I use two computers, one of which is the Cintiq companion itself, and the other is an Apple computer that's connected to a much older Cintiq 21UX. The 21UX is now in its 9th year, which I think is pretty impressive. I've modified it a little bit. I tore off the screen protector that comes with the device, and I've got this nice glass screen that I draw on with a rubber nib. I think they call them the flex nibs with the pens. But the 21UX has been just absolutely brilliant for the past 9 years, and I love it to death. The companion is great because it allows me to take it away from the home, and that really is the ultimate tool for me, because I really love being able to work outside and go to cafes and draw, and it gives me a chance to meet people and have them ask questions, kind of like you guys are asking. So it's a lot of fun to interact with people and get out in nature. So I really like the combination of those devices, and I would say I use them about 50-50. I do find it's a little bit easier for me on the bigger screen to get the kinds of details that I want. So I've been working professionally for quite a while, and I've invested in good equipment that is it gives me the luxury to draw the way that I want to, depending on how I'm feeling. So I do recommend that if you move into doing this for a living, or if you do this for a living, consider possibly even getting multiple types of devices like this over time, and you can really increase the range of your ability to draw digitally. Question is, what stylus equipment are you using? Cintiq, Intuos, or something cheaper? Well, I just explained that I use the Cintiqs, but I did in the past use Intuos. And this brings me to another point altogether, which is if you are, say, an amateur artist, I do recommend that you look into an Intuos tablet. Okay, I used an Intuos tablet right after college. I graduated in 2003, and Cintiqs were not around yet. Even if they were, I wouldn't have been able to afford one. But the Intuos tablet, which I think I started using in 2003, I used that until about 2008. I think 2008 was when it was 2007, I think I bought the Cintiq. So yeah, once I got the Cintiq, I didn't use the Intuos. One benefit of the Intuos tablet, even though there is that separation, it's actually because of the separation between the drawing and the screen. One thing I like about that is it helps you with your posture. You can look straight ahead and keep your back straight while you draw down on the tablet, which maybe to people who don't do this an awful lot, that doesn't sound like a very big deal, but it really is. If you're, the Cintiq is much more traditional. It's like you're hunching over an art desk, and just like many artists of the past, we'll end up with all these back problems, and if we do it too much. So make sure to get up and stretch and get your exercise. Okay, next question was, what type of drawing pad are you using? I'm interested in a Cintiq monitor, but the price is hefty. Not sure how much better the monitor is versus a drawing pad. Okay, I've alluded to my absolute love affair with Wacom and the Cintiq products in the past. So you're talking to a very biased source. So let me I guess let me say that right up front. Regarding Cintiq's price, well, I think it's absolutely and indisputably worth it. This Cintiq 21UX that is right in front of me here at my desk, I got, as I said, it's 9 years old. Okay, when I bought it, I believe it cost me either $2,000 or $2,500, and I paid for it through a job. It was actually a job to do digital illustration, and I had to do a series of 8 or 9 illustrations. And I was able to command a pretty good price for the illustrations, and I poured it right into a Cintiq, and I think I paid for a little bit with my savings, and it was absolutely worth it. Using a device like this for 9 years. First of all, I mean, what is that, like, $200, $250 a year or so. So it's really not too bad if you use it over a long, long period of time. The other thing is just bear in mind that, like if I'll go into a coffee shop and they'll have, some piece of equipment in there that costs them $15,000 that makes coffee. It's like, if you're a professional, you want professional equipment, all right? And the cost is high, but you're also making money on it. If you're not making money on it, then you're looking at professional products that are naturally going to look expensive. But the other thing that I want to bring up about the Cintiq is to talk specifically about the companion. I've heard a lot of complaints over the price of the companion, and actually I want to do I'm going to be doing a separate video because I'm getting, let's say I'm getting frustrated about the fact that I'm not sure that people are understanding why the companion costs what it does, because I think it's being viewed as a device that's very similar to say the iPad or something like that. And it's important to really differentiate the companion in terms of what it features and why an artist like me who spends, many, many hours, per week drawing loves the companion to death and why it's the perfect product. You just have to be in that camp where you are drawing this much. You have to be a certain type of customer to really justify the cost and the value of a Cintiq. But I really can't speak highly enough about the Cintiq. That said, again, the experience of drawing on a pad, like an Intuos, is great as well. It just depends on what you're going for, and it depends on your level of skill. I mean, if you want to go and buy, $100 Intuos tablet, I think you can get one for probably $100, or buy one used or something like that, and just get going as an amateur artist. You can basically draw everything that I've done in Dreamside on that. I mean, it's absolutely doable. It's just there are certain luxuries that come with the Cintiq that make it probably a little bit easier to get that done. And so ultimately, what I would say is, if you're an amateur, start small, don't spend an awful lot of money, but work your way up to a Cintiq or other equivalent product. And I think you'll find yourself. I think you'll see the value of it over time. It won't even be a question. Okay, next question. My main monitor and Cintiq have different color configurations. Which should I trust for good printing results? Okay, that's a really tough one because I really don't know myself. I'm sort of learning as I go. And two, because the more time I spend on it, the less I realize I really care. But what I would do is, if color... Okay, well, let me just explain why I really don't care. I don't care because I have a printer at home, and all of Dreamside's work was printed in RGB. All right, and so when it prints, of course, it converts to CMYK. So naturally, there's going to be a color conversion there. And I do think that for my purposes, I have an iMac screen that I think is pretty good, but I know the iMac screens are they're kind of blown out a little bit. They're sort of, I don't know if blown out's the word, but they have a high contrast to them. They might not be the best way to view it and get it exactly right. But for my purposes, it's fine. I do print tests, and yes, the colors are a little bit different on paper, but I just don't care. What's more important to me is the relative use of color. If I have a red versus a green, that's gonna create a certain experience. So if when I print, the red gets pushed to magenta and the green gets pushed to blue, that's okay because they're I guess the relationship is still intact, even though it tinted the colors, I guess, so to speak. But if it's really important to you to get color exactly right, then I think you really need to look into monitor calibration, and that's something I really don't know anything about. Sorry. All right, next section is shortcuts. Okay, next question. What keys are you using to move in and out so quickly when making changes? All right, so the Cintiq both the Cintiq and the Cintiq Pen have hotkeys on them. The Pen has 2, and the Cintiq has more. I'm actually referring to both the Companion and the 21UX. So they both have hotkeys that can be assigned to different button configurations. And what I found works really well for me is to assign the pen buttons, the one of them to zoom in and one to zoom out. And that's because it's a very quick, I tend to, as you can see when I'm drawing, I zoom in and out very, very frequently. Part of it's because I'll zoom in very, very close so that I can make an easy stroke, maybe for an area of detail. And then I'll zoom back out to check how the overall thing is looking. It is, possible on a dual screen configuration to have a zoomed out version on your other screen. So it's not necessary to zoom in and out like this so much, but I've just gotten very used to having that degree of control. And on the buttons on the Cintiq itself, I'll keep, the control to pan, to do a rotate. It's called arc rotate in Photoshop, and I honestly can't remember what it's called in Manga Studio, but it's essentially the arc rotate tool. And that way I can zoom in and out, I can pan, and I can rotate, and it just gives me the same kind of control as if I had a piece of paper right in front of me. All right, question, sorry for the late question, but which is the shortcut for reflecting the image so quickly? Well, that's, I guess as I'm speaking, I don't really know. It's just flip horizontal, I believe is what it's called. And you can go into the preferences or the hotkey settings, if I'm not mistaken, and you can assign that button pretty much anywhere you want within the toolbar. But if you're looking for it, I think where it is as a standard is in the Navigator tab. So you'll find just flip horizontal, just move the mouse around until the context-sensitive description pops up, and it should tell you which one is the flip horizontal. So yeah. Question was, I didn't quite catch how the toggle between pencil and eraser is set up. Love that digital ability to switch it without having to click back and forth between icons. Okay, so again, I just have a hotkey that's set to the E key, which is the eraser, within Manga Studio. So I just click that button, and what's really cool about the eraser, as well as certain other functions, is that they are what's called a spring-loaded function. So it works two ways. One, if I just tap the button, if I tap the E key, it will switch the pen or the brush or whatever I'm using currently to the eraser, and it'll keep it as the eraser. But then if you do that, you need to switch back to the brush, which means that you either need to hit the B key for brush, or you need to assign another hotkey. So the other thing I like to do is usually when I'm doing the eraser, I'm doing it very quickly. I'm saying, oh, I want to refine this line a little bit, and so I'll erase this. I'll make a quick erasure stroke. So I don't want to switch permanently to the eraser. The spring-loaded function makes it possible to do this. What you do is if instead of pressing the button, you hold it in, it will temporarily switch it to the eraser. Then you can make your stroke, and then when you let go of the button, it'll just pop back to the brush stroke. So that's how I'm doing that so quickly. I'm using the spring-loaded function. Okay, the next section is called resolution. Okay, this is going to be an interesting section because I'm probably not going to know a lot of these questions. All right, well, the first question is, how do you choose the size resolution of your canvas when you start in? Do you have a default? Well, I do have a default for all the images within Dreamside because I'm using the Manga Studio 5 EX story function. So I set up a standard, and then every new page that I make has that same resolution. So I'm picking a resolution that's 600 dpi purely based upon the inches that I know the book is going to be printed at. So because I'm planning to print a book that's around 8.5 by 11 inches, I choose 600 dpi, and then I have an appropriate resolution, which is quite large. And the other thing too is that I set up the pages as full spreads. So I combine the left and the right page. So my image resolution is somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,000 by 7,000. Okay, next question is, what is the most optimal resolution? Well, that is actually, for me, that is an optimal resolution because 600 dpi is going to look really great when it prints. On the other hand, you may be looking for something that is a lower resolution, and in fact, sometimes what I find is it's easier. In fact, I will say it is consistently easier to paint at a low resolution especially when you're doing roughs. So sometimes, if I need to just work out a drawing, I might not even do it on the actual story page. I'll make a new document that's much lower resolution, say a 72 dpi, and I'll do my sketch because the lower resolution, it makes it so that you're not worried so much about every little pencil stroke kind of, that you can see every little tiny mistake that you make. With a lower resolution, it makes it much easier to just focus on the general overall shapes, and you're not so concerned about the quality of the line. So sometimes jumping back and forth between resolutions can be helpful. Okay, question. If I'm planning on enlarging 400% larger than the page, should I produce the page at 1200 dpi to ensure detail and saturation on the larger scale? I think that's one way of doing it, sure. But, what you can also do, I mean, I would just set it up so that you have the dimensions, the inches or the centimeters, have that be at the print size, okay? And then just make it 600 dpi. Or 300 dpi is fine too. But just make it at the resolution that it's going to, or the dimensions that it's going to be, and that will avoid any confusion. You're not really having to deal with multiplying anything. Of course, if you're going to print something, say at double the size of what you've assigned the document to be, then and you want it to be printed at 600 dpi, then yes, you could make it 1200 dpi, and you'll have the information. But the printer, I think, is ultimately going to want the page to have those dimensions described exactly right. Otherwise it's going to, if they just send it right to print and it'll print at the smaller size and it will just be at 1200 dpi, and the printer might not even handle 1200 dpi. So I would just avoid all that hassle and just make it the right dimensions right in the beginning. Okay, question was, do you draw in the same DPI and page size as you're going to publish, or do you draw a bigger page first, then resize it to the size suited for the published page? So this is really the same question as before in a way, but there is one thing that I do want to add to this, is I think the person who asked this question may be thinking in very traditional terms. This is what we used to do with comic pages. We would draw on a bigger sheet of paper that would then be reduced. And the reason we would do that is that it makes it easier to focus on details. Well, with digital, that's not necessary anymore, because now we can simply zoom in. Of course, traditionally, you're working on a piece of paper. You can't, unless you've got some sort of magical eye, you can't zoom in on the page. You can use magnifying glasses or, a special headset or something that can help you get a closer, detailed look. But, when we're working digitally, we can just zoom in. So I wouldn't worry about drawing bigger. I would do it at the same exact page dimensions and DPI that you want with the printed page. And then when you need to draw detail, just zoom in as you see me doing. Okay, the next question is about layers. Do you keep highlights and shadows on unique layers? Yes, I do to a point, and then I will ultimately combine them together. I keep the highlights and shadows on unique layers. I don't actually usually do all that much highlighting work. I usually put my base colors in at sort of the brightness level that I want it to be, and then I will paint the shadow over that. Another thing that I do add that's a little bit special is that I typically do some bounce light in the shadow area, and that I think gives it a nice watercolor wash look. And everything that I do, but I also do color overlays. I'll use an overlay layer where I will say amplify, maybe make the cheeks, the skin color look a little bit rosier, and so I'll use a big soft kind of reddish brush over the skin on a separate overlay layer, and then I'll kind of make it glow with color a little bit more intensely. So I do keep everything. I work with a lot of layers, and then ultimately I'll combine stuff together. Okay, question was, do you prefer to work with vector layers or raster? I've never worked with vector layers, so only raster. That was a quick one. Next question was, how do you distribute your work on layers? Well, I go to a new layer whenever I'm working on something that I don't want to be forced to keep. All right, so if I'm unsure about something, so if I'm doing base colors, usually I will keep them on the same layer. But say, for example, I want to try something that's a little bit unique. Maybe I want to do some sort of surreal effect with the character's hair. So instead of drawing the typical hair color, I'll draw like in the space that's the hair, I'll draw like a sky. All right. And so I'll keep that on a separate layer, maybe if I don't know that it's going to work. All right. So usually, as I mentioned before, I don't have a really great ability to visualize ahead of time what I want the pictures to look like. So because of that, I need to sometimes keep things on separate layers. So I do recommend you go to a new layer anytime you're unsure about something. You can always combine it together. So why not just do a new layer? And the only disadvantage, of course, is that you end up getting so many layers that it's confusing what's on what. But that's just kind of a nature of getting the benefit of layers. Next question was, do you use the vector layers for inking, or do you keep the raster pencil layer for your line work? Oh, I answered that one. It's raster only. I also don't really do inking with Dreamside. I do use the ink brushes for other images for other projects, but for Dreamside, I only use the pencil tools. Okay, the next set is called Starting Out. What advice would you give for someone starting a comic independently? Okay, that's a tough one. That's a really tough question because it's very in depth, and there's a lot of ways that I can answer this. But I'm actually going to take a step back and answer this a bit philosophically right up front. Basically, you need to love it. You need to love it to death. You almost need to love it more than yourself. Maybe you do have to love it more than your own life. I don't even know. But I know that when you work on something that is very, very challenging, it's very big. I would say the Dreamside's a bit of an unusual project because it's so big, it's so epic, it's so massive. It's not a 32-pager. It's not something that I'm drawing in a quick way. The art is complex, the story's complex, everything is complicated and epic about the story. And so because of that, I have to really love it, and I do. I absolutely am gonzo for Dreamside and for these characters. And the reason that you have to do that is that once you get past the honeymoon stage, that stage where basically you say, hey, I want to make a book. I'm going to get started today. And you sit down, you're going to get excited for the first day, maybe the first couple hours. Maybe you're going to wake up excited the next day. And at some point, it may be within the first hour, it may be within the first week. It may not happen for a few weeks or a month. You're going to hit the first big wall. Okay? And that wall is going to scare you a lot. And there's two ways to respond to that wall. You either, climb over that wall or bust through it or whatever you have to do, whatever metaphor you want to use. But you've got to push through that wall, or you're going to turn around and go home because you're going to say, okay, I don't want to do this. I like video games. The other day I was playing a video game. It was an older game. And it was fun. I'd been hearing a lot about this game over the years. I thought, I'll give it a try. But I sat down with it, and I'm thinking, I got to a point in the game where I realized that the value the game was providing for me was not going to be greater than the amount of time and effort that I was going to spend to get through it. And I thought, well, I just dropped it. And I don't think there's any dishonor in doing that. And it would be the same thing like if you're working on a book and you get going with it and you say, look, I don't know that this is going to provide me with that benefit that makes it worth pushing through and working so hard on it, okay? And so you've got to come up with a good, solid reason why you want to do this, and you have to love it to death. If you have that, psychologically, you can push through the extreme challenges that you're going to face. And again, depending on how much of a perfectionist you are, like I'm at the absolute peak of perfectionism. So for me, it's very easy for me to get disheartened as I go, because I'm always trying to do something that's a little more challenging. I always try to bite off more than I can chew. So for you, maybe you want to do that kind of thing where you're going to be a perfectionist and you've got to be in love with it. Maybe if you can treat it in a more casual way, if you're okay producing artwork that's very quick to produce, if you come up with a good method to do something quickly and it's not a lot of effort, you find a way to have fun with it, you can do it. There's so many different ways to approach it. But I do think that regardless of what it is that you work on, there's going to be some degree of challenge that you're going to face, and it's going to make it hard to push through that wall. And so you've got to have a good reason to make it through. And so I'm gonna leave the answer at that and sort of answer it in that, I guess, philosophical way, instead of talking about really a lot of specifics, because I could go on for hours and hours talking about what you need to do, at every step of the way. But again, that's probably something for another video. Okay, next question was, what did you use to do your art when you were starting out? Well, I mean, I started, of course, with crayons and paper and pencils, and then when I went digital, I'd say I actually started with a mouse for a while, but I wasn't doing too much actual drawing on the computer screen. I would probably draw something traditionally, scan it in, and then color it using a mouse in Photoshop. But, then I moved on to the Intuos, as I alluded to before, and then I moved on to the Cintiq, and I haven't really looked back. I do occasionally use traditional media for fun, but when I need to get some serious work done, I usually will load up the Cintiq. Next question is, how many times or how long did it take to draw the character until you could draw it so naturally? That's a funny question, because I actually don't think I can draw the characters very naturally, because despite the fact that I've drawn Sarah, probably, I don't even know, easily thousands of times I've drawn this character. I still have a really tough time with her. And I think part of the reason for that is because I never did a very good job of making the character very iconic and pulling out the things about the character that are I guess I just never did the work to make a foundation for the character that would be easy to duplicate. And so what's happened is the character has evolved so substantially over the years that the way to draw Sarah now is different than the way I drew Sarah a year ago. And the same thing goes for the Dream Girl and every other character I do. And this is one of the reasons that I'm doing this additional pass of the Dreamside artwork, is because I want to clarify finally a look that I can keep consistent for books 2 and 3. That way I don't end up with a very different look in book 3 than I have in book 1. So yes, I've drawn Sarah thousands of times, but I honestly can't say that I draw it all that naturally. Maybe I do and I just don't even realize it, but I don't really think so, because I'll have days where I spend hours on Sarah's face and I can't understand why it's not working. So I actually don't really think I do draw it all that naturally. All right, question was, do you do text in Manga Studio 5 or in some other program, and which one would be better for new digital artists? I do all my text in Manga Studio 5. I did design a font using separate software, and I put the text in Manga Studio. And part of the reason that I do this is because I want to manipulate the text artistically. I don't just do a text block. And so I want to incorporate it as much in the drawing process. And since I do all of the art within Manga Studio, I keep the text in there as well. Okay, next question. Next series is called Planning. Question: how do you keep yourself on a schedule as far as drawing comic pages, like weekly versus monthly? Well, I draw every day. I work every day, and my schedule is terrible. I don't do a good job of scheduling. This is probably a byproduct of being independent, and I do recommend that you work on a schedule basis as much as possible. And part of the reason is because what I find is that when I do schedule my time, first of all, I always schedule things to be harder than they have to be, and harder than I can actually achieve. I'll say, I'll finish this painting by Friday, but I end up finishing the painting the following Friday. Okay, but what I find is if I don't schedule, it will typically take me longer than if I did. And so it's usually worth it to put some sort of a schedule down. But honestly, one of the best ways to do it, I do notice that there's a big change that's occurred in my mind over the past few years. It used to be that when I sat down to draw for Dreamside, once I passed the honeymoon period and it got difficult, it was a chore to sit down and draw. But what I find today is that I draw every single day. There's really not a single day that I don't dedicate at least an hour to working on Dreamside, and that includes weekends and that includes holidays. I don't think I've missed maybe more than one day within the 365 days of the last year. And so I think you just get used to it over time, but I would recommend that if you want to develop that habit, just draw every single day. Okay, next question was Mr. Cumbo. Thank you for doing this today and letting me be a part of it. How do you decide what ideas to turn into a frame and what to omit? Well, thank you for that compliment. I appreciate it. And what ideas do I decide to turn into a frame? Okay, that just comes down to planning. I do a lot of sketches, and I do. It's been so long with the first book. I've been redoing the work so much that I almost. I haven't touched the thumbnail process in so long, but I do thumbnails. And my thumbnails will start really, really simplistically. Like I'll draw a stick figure over some depiction of background, which I maybe even will just spell out. I'll say, I'll draw a stick figure of Sarah, and then I'll put it over the words forest, dark forest in the background or whatever. Okay, so I will do thumbnails like that, and that allows me to figure out how I want to do the most basic breakdown of the layout, which means figuring out the relationship between the images and the text. And once I go from there, I'll detail it a little bit more, and then I'll bring it right onto the page, and I'll just begin developing it. I actually go right to the sort of final, if you want to call it final art, quickly because of the nature of digital. I don't have to work things out and then do another layer. I can actually just refine the line art that was used for the sketch and bring that to final, especially since Dreamside uses a bit more of a kind of watercolor sketch look than a finished sort of perfect ink line. Okay. And also to add to that a little bit, in terms of what to omit, I do constantly refine images, even when they're very close to finished. I might look at it and say, well, I'm not happy with this element of the image that's a bit distracting, and so I'll cut that out. Or maybe I'll say, well, this part's beautiful, but I want the focus to be on A instead of B, and I've got way too much work done in B, and I may have spent a long time on B, but I'll chop it right out. Sometimes also I will eliminate entire images. In fact, I just did that the other day. It was pretty heartbreaking, but I cut out an image that I had, finished because I wanted to blow up another image and there wasn't room, and it wasn't flowing in terms of the story. It really just comes down to what your story needs. If you're thinking in terms of visual storytelling, then you need to realize that every element, whether it's text or it's images, is going to add or subtract to the experience of reading your story. And so you need to just keep sort of testing it, keep reading it, keep looking at it and seeing how it feels, see how the pacing feels. Do you have too many or too few images for a specific section? It's a challenge. Okay, question was, when designing characters, do you plan out their personality and background first, or their look and aesthetic? I would say I plan out their personality and background, and I do it all in text. And then I sort of proceed to do a look and aesthetic. Understanding how they act and how they move will help me figure out their poses. I do tend to like to stay away from some of the more stereotypical ideas of how characters look and how that matches personality, because I never really liked that whole thing about having the kind eyes or the evil face. I just don't really think that's, I mean, I guess there's some logic to it because people seem to think it pretty consistently. I like maybe stretching expectations a little bit. I might make a character who is, maybe I'll make a character who's an evil character, very attractive or very beautiful, and kind of put those kind eyes on the character. But I'll have the action that's being taken a little bit twisted. Maybe they have beautiful eyes, but the eyes are never quite looking at you. Okay, so this sort of decision about their actions, I think, makes for a more interesting depiction of character. And beauty is not necessarily associated with goodness or that sort of thing. And so, yes, understanding as much as I can about the character before I start drawing will help me a great deal with that. All right, next question. What are the steps you go through for painting an object or person, like base color, shading, and lighting? Well, I do everything with a sketch first. I didn't used to do this all the time. Sometimes I would go and write with color and try stuff, but now I do everything pretty much with an outline. And I'll get the details just right. And that way it makes it a lot easier for me to put in the base color, which I do. I put in base color for pretty much everything. Then I do shading. You got it just right. In base color, I put the shadows in. I put some degree of bounce light, and then I'll bring out highlights. Finally, I'll do some degree of color overlay, and then I'll add effects on top of that. That's my order. Question, how do you work before you start drawing a graphic novel? Do you write a whole script with every scene panel described, or do you use a rough plot? I work from a writing perspective first, and I have a process of getting. I think in terms of the character breakdown in terms of arcs for each character, and then I attach those together and develop a story out of that. My method of writing has gotten far more procedural than it used to be, and I actually want to mention a book that's been extremely valuable to me. It's called. It's a book by Stan Williams called The Moral Premise. And I think that it's just the most insanely valuable resource for somebody who wants to tell stories. I think it's fantastic because it helps you understand the whys behind characters' actions and how they evolve from sort of a moral perspective, and how they move from positions of vice versus virtue. And I think that has helped me more than any other story. I really don't use any sort of how-to books, but that's the only one that I use. It's the only one that I will openly recommend to somebody. And so in terms of deciding stories, the story direction, I think that's really valuable. So check out that book, and it'll help you understand why I work purely in terms of story and then I'll do the art. And another reason for that, of course, is that it's much quicker to write than it is to draw. For me to write a description of a character can take me, 30 seconds. To, draw that character can take me hours, if not days or weeks or even months, sometimes to get a character just right in terms of visuals. So it's much quicker for me to go through and do the words than the art. Okay, next question. Did you lay out your book one page at a time or plan for a flow through the whole book? Well, okay, this relates to the previous question. I write everything, and then once I have a solid depiction of how I want the story to happen, I'll break the story up into thumbnails, and I'll sort of designate certain sections of the story to each page, and I'll determine how long or short a section has to be within the story, and then that will help me determine how much time to spend, or how much importance that section should have within a page. Maybe it's a really key scene. Like, for example, in Chapter 2 in Dreamside, well, I should say in Chapter 1 in Dreamside, Sarah has a dream. She sees this mysterious girl that fascinates her, but it's in a dream. She wakes up, all right? And that's all normal. We can understand that. At the end of Chapter 2, though, something magical happens. She sees the dream girl from her dream in the real world. Okay, so that's where now there's been a shift. We understand something about this story that we didn't understand before, that there's magic in this story. Because this character from her dream, that we know is from her dream, is now here in real life. And there's elements about her that are very magical and things that we know that wouldn't work in the real world. So because that's such a pivotal moment, I wanted it to be a full spread so that when you turn the page, you're just wowed by this event. Okay, and originally in the previous pass, I had it only on the right side, and that was a bad idea because when you turn the page, it spoiled that event before you saw what was on the left side of the page, which was designed to lead into the right. Okay, so I needed it to be on its separate spread. So that's how that's an example of what I think about when I'm planning the book out. Okay, the next question is pretty much the same. When you're working on your pages, do you plan or storyboard them in advance? So I feel like I've answered that. Okay, going down to the next section is software. Question. Apparently it seems to be, I think this person meant to say, apparently Manga Studio seems to be a software to support animation. But what are the advantages of using Manga Studio in this regard? Only storyboarding or tables for traditional animation? Any possibility to export vector graphic? Well, exporting vector graphics I believe you can do, but I haven't done it myself, so I can't answer that. I would say that Manga Studio is more of an illustration software than an animation software. Smith Micro offers Anime Studio, which is a separate actual animation software. And of course, there's many other options, for doing 3D animation. And so, I would say that Manga Studio, you can to some degree. In fact, I'm going to put a link right here to another video I did. This is a little test comic that I made for just doing, it's just fan art of Super Mario, but done as a test for an animated comic. And so I did all the animation frames that you see in there in Manga Studio. Actually, everything was painted in Manga Studio. So, you can use Manga Studio for animation in the sense that you can make new layers to be different animation frames. But there are advantages to using something like Anime Studio, which is, allows you to... Actually, I really haven't used Anime Studio myself, but I understand that it's made more specifically for animation, which lets you, first of all, it lets you do things like play the animation so that you can see how it's flowing, which is a really important thing, of course. So I don't know that I would recommend Manga Studio specifically for animation, but of course you could use it for your foundational drawing if you want to plan out a scene or a concept or whatever. Manga Studio is fantastic for that. I don't think it really can be beat. Next question is, I'm very new to Manga Studio 5 EX. I'm very accustomed to Photoshop CS6. I bought it for the features, but after further inspection, I noticed that the export features aren't as versatile for laying out a book for print in InDesign. Would you suggest exporting the art, then placing the pages in InDesign for print production? I don't want to have my text rasterized during exporting Manga Studio. Okay, yeah, to be honest, I don't know much about this person's question at all. I pretty much export everything out of Manga Studio the way that I want it to be printed. It's possible I'll bring it into Photoshop and do some post effects. There might be some things I can do a little bit easier in Photoshop, and so I'll do that. I'm actually not working with InDesign, so I don't know how to answer that question. But I would think that if you want to maintain the ability to modify your text, then yes, I would just paint the raster graphics within Manga Studio and then bring it into your InDesign software, and you can do your additional features. Combine the two of them together. Because if you're working with InDesign, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, in a comment below, but my understanding is that you would still need to work with another painting software. I don't think you can paint your full graphic range in InDesign. So you're basically either coming from Photoshop into InDesign or Manga Studio into InDesign. So you can get your artwork ready from Manga Studio and then import it. Okay, next question. First off, I want to say that I love the idea of Dreamside and the idea of eye pointing to text. I'm a concept artist in the game industry, just like where you come from, and I would love to know if you think that Manga Studio is usable for concept art workflow. Absolutely it is. In fact, the way that I learned about Manga Studio was from a few concept artists that I worked with at Insomniac, who I greatly respect. And if you want to see the type of work that can be done in Manga Studio, just go and check out creaturebox.com, and you'll see these are guys who are using it for some of I think the greatest art in the concept art world. And they use Manga Studio, and so I really do think, at least I believe they're using Manga Studio. I don't want to make that claim, but I have spoken to them about it in the past, and I know that the preference is there. And I know for a fact, just through personal experience, that Manga Studio is a fantastic painting software, and I do recommend it. It's maybe I'm biased, but it's a software that I like to use after trying a lot of different packages. There are some things that Manga Studio is going to have and things that it's not going to have. And so it's a matter of weighing what you need. But, one thing I love about the folks at Smith Micro is that they are very approachable about ideas. I've actually spoken a few times to them about some features that I felt were missing from Manga Studio, missing, I should say, comparatively to other software. Or something that I think would be cool, and then I found that it exists in the next version, and that's pretty amazing to be able to have that sort of influence on the development of the software. And I really love that about Manga Studio. So absolutely, it will definitely work for you. In fact, one more thing about Manga Studio is the perspective rulers. If you're doing concept art and you need to do big cityscapes or something like that, the perspective rulers are going to be a major benefit to you. Okay, next question. Do you work switching between Photoshop and Manga Studio often? Okay, I do pretty much everything in Manga Studio, but I do sometimes bring an image into Photoshop for some of the very few features that I can't do within Manga Studio. And so I wouldn't say I switch often. I pretty much just might do a little bit of post-graphic effect in Photoshop. Question is, thank you. How do you go about copywriting a major comic project like this? Well, that depends on where you're coming from. If you're in the U.S. like I am, you basically just send a big PDF a folder compressed full of artwork from your project, and you can copyright the lot of it. I know there's a fee associated with it, but you can visit the copyright website. Make sure you go into the government website. And you can learn about copywriting there. I don't want to give any specific legal advice as I'm not a lawyer. Question, does he ever use the gradient map layer type? I'm sorry to say I have no idea what that is. So I'm going to have to skip that question. Sorry. All right, final files. Question was, for final files, do you produce a layered PSD or a big flat JPEG? Well, if by final you mean the file that I deliver to the printer to go to press, then I end up exporting a TIFF series that will be combined together into a PDF ultimately. And I keep a version of the layered files. Manga Studio has an equivalent. It has a proprietary format that keeps everything in its layers. So of course I keep the layered file backed up for any edits that I have to make, and then I will export a flattened image ultimately. Okay, next question. Is there a real Sarah? Oh, well, no. There's not a real Sarah exactly, but in a way there is, because Sarah, much like most of my characters, is inspired by people that I know in real life. And one of the main inspirations for Dreamside, if not the main inspiration, was a volunteer time at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh that I did for about 6 months back in college. And I got to meet a lot of young kids who were in the hospital long-term and short-term, dealing with different sort of illnesses. And that was very inspiring to me. And one of the things that I really loved about these kids was how open they were to, anything artistic. I felt that there was an unusual amount of interest in creating something, and I think in a way that maybe has resonated in my mind, because that's kind of Sarah's main deal, is that she is very creative and she's got an amazing imagination. And so I would say that if we're talking about the personality, it's sort of a hodgepodge of different people that I've met in real life. Okay, next question. Is there a reason you choose oil paint as opposed to marker or watercolor? Well, I assume you're speaking digitally. Yeah, I just really like the way the brush works. I've tried using the markers and the watercolor. I really don't like working with digital markers because I think they sort of defeat the purpose of working digitally. Markers are intentionally designed so that you cannot add a lighter value over top, and sometimes I need to get in and paint in with light and sort of more of a... I'm really trying to mimic the feel of painting in gouache more so than watercolor, and more so than oil, because I do think that the oil paintbrush really feels more like gouache, and that's a great graphic medium. It's what Disney always used for backgrounds, because you can paint in both light and dark, and you still get that sort of nice gentle watercolor look to it. So that's why I pick it. The question was, Mr. Cumbo, first and foremost, your work is awesome. What kept you motivated throughout your art career? Well, it's what I do. It's what I've always loved. And I think I was always very excited about the idea of telling stories and having that become a real thing that could move other people. I think about movies and stories and games that I've loved throughout the years. And I want to be part of that group that makes something that touches people in a very real way that then becomes part of their... it becomes part of who they are. And I do also believe that stories can be very influential. I think that they can encourage people to think a certain way, maybe it helps people sort of reflect on their own experiences in their life. And for a case of something like Dreamside, I mean, the motivation comes from wanting to tell a story to a group that really doesn't get a lot of stories written specifically for them, at least not in a realistic way. I mean, what sort of story do you give, say a 10-year-old who is dealing with terminal cancer? And of course, there are plenty of enjoyable stories. I mean, distracting stories. But what about the story that helps them examine the thing that's right in front of the elephant in the room, and actually takes a good hard look at it and says, look, do you want to think about life a little bit? Do you want to think about death? Because somebody in that position is dealing with a premature challenge that the rest of us, if we're lucky, don't have to worry about until we're much older. And so that's the kind of thing that can motivate me. And I think about people getting that benefit. It makes it very easy to deal with the challenges of the artwork, because it's really small potatoes when you think about the benefits that it could potentially provide. Not to I don't want to sound pretentious, but these are things I have to tell myself. I have to elevate the importance of what I'm doing so that I can stick with it. So there you go. Elevate the importance of what you're doing. Become pretentious, and you can push through the challenge. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up all the questions that I have. If I didn't get to any, please, if you feel free to ask any questions you want in the comments below. You can also always send me any questions you like at my email, which is david@dmcumbo.com. You can also reach me by going to dmcumbo.com and clicking on the contact link and send me a message. I always love hearing from people. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to ask them. I'll do my best to answer them. I'll try not to take another 8 months to do so, and I'll answer them in a pretty speedy method, especially if you leave comments below. Or you can always hit me up on Twitter. Go to Twitter. I'm DMCumbo on Twitter. I'm pretty much DMCumbo on every social media that I'm on. So make sure to follow me. But yeah, always feel free to tweet out to me, and I'm very quick to respond. So I'm very happy to be able to help anybody design whatever their dream is to design. I really want to encourage that and help facilitate that any way that I can with any advice, because it's exactly what I'm doing. Frankly, it's inspiring to me. It's motivating to me to talk to you and learn more about what you're doing. And I just really believe that everybody's got some sort of a story. Everybody's got something that they can add to the world that's from their own perspective. And if you've got that desire to put it into something, to share with other people, then, by all means, make it happen. Don't give up on your dream to make it happen. Even if you have to, just spend a few hours here and there when you can, maybe you get 20 minutes every day that you could focus on it. Find a way to get it done and don't give up on it, all right? And if you get stuck, you can always reach out to me. So I know this was a pretty long video, so thanks for sticking with me. And once again, to all the people who came to the webinar and asked these questions, I want to say thank you again, and I am sorry for taking so long to answer. I also want to reach out and say one big thank you to the folks at Smith Micro and the Clip Studio, the Japanese developers of the software. Your software has really, as I've said many times in the past, to say the same thing to the folks at Wacom, you develop products that make it possible for myself and many others to pursue our dreams, and so I'm very thankful for that. So a big thank you to everybody. I hope you had fun today, and come back and see me again really soon.